Hey everyone, welcome back to our Friday seminar series here at the Freeman Spogli Institute. I'm Michael McFall, the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Today we have a very special event and a special guest, a friend of mine, Phil Gordon. Phil is currently a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. In the Obama administration, he had, well, two giant jobs. He's had many jobs over the decades in government, but he was Special Assistant to the President and White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf region from 2013 to 2015. And prior to that, he served as Assistant Secretary for State for European and Eurasian Affairs, where I worked very closely with him when I was at the White House and later in Moscow. I actually have a very fond memory, Phil, of you coming to Moscow in that job. Today, we're going to be discussing, to be more precise, Brett McGurk and Phil are going to be discussing his brand new book. It's called Losing the Long Game. Here it is, The False Promise of Regime Change in the Middle East. I know that after this discussion, you are going to be motivated to learn more, but I want to implore you not just to listen today, but to buy this book. Because if you don't buy these kinds of books, they don't get written. And we need these kinds of books to be smarter about how the United States deals with the outside world. My own view as we go into a transition right now to a new administration is that, I actually think the policy parameters of how to deal with China are pretty clear. In the margins, there'll be tweaks. I actually think they're pretty clear with respect to Russia and Europe. I don't think they're very clear with respect to the Middle East. I actually think that is a place where there are some really big choices that have to be made. And that's why I think Phil's book is incredibly well-timed to be hitting the markets, hitting the the virtual book tour as we're doing today right now. With us today is also Brett McGurk, who will lead the discussion and moderate questions. I think many of you already know Brett, but he is currently the FSI Payne Distinguished Lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, which is part of FSI. He's served in multiple senior roles in the White House. I suspect you're going to hear about some of their stories together with these two gentlemen, both the Obama, Bush, and Trump administrations on some of the hardest issues in the Middle East over the last decade. So, Brett, thanks a lot for joining us. He will be moderating. Let me turn it over to you both, and to remind everybody, they're going to talk, I think, amongst themselves for 15 or 20 minutes, and then you can join the conversation. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'm sure Brett will get to as many as he can. The recording of this session will be available at our website at fsi.stanford.edu, along with all of FSI's commentary and analysis. So we encourage you to stay engaged with us. So over to you, Brett, over to you, Phil, but I want to remind everybody, don't just listen in, you got to buy this book. Thanks a lot. Brett, it's over to you.
Mike, thanks so much. And I've been looking forward to this. We put this on the calendar a couple months ago, in which felt like, after the election, who knows where we'll be, and here we are. Time flies, and such an interesting moment in history, and also to have this important conversation with you, Phil. I also have the book here. You can see it through my virtual background. But I would, again, I think recommend everybody to purchase this book. I read some of it, Phil, in the production. You were very gracious to share some of it with me. And then in preparing for this, actually, I've been on the audiobook just listening to each chapter when I go out for a little run to get out. And it's like perfect nuggets, 45 minutes or so. And just everyone listening, the amount you can learn in every chapter of this book, I think, is quite extraordinary. Both Phil comes at this from a practitioner level and also from the academic to really study these issues in depth. It's just fascinating. I will say also, kind of mutual admiration society here. I've been in the Situation Room with Phil and the President of the United States in the Obama administration. And Phil never shies from speaking exactly what he thinks and what his analysis of a situation entails. And I've seen that up close. And I think that's really essential for any of us who try to steer and guide presidents through these most intense kind of crises that we'll talk about. So Phil, welcome. I'll turn it over to you here, but it's kind of an opening question. I think conventional wisdom now would be, well, we're never really going to do one of these again. We're never going to get into another regime change in the Middle East after all we've been through. But I think your book kind of just painting the history over the last 50, 60, 70 years, I think tells a different story. So just what gave you the idea, a little bit about what the process of writing the book was like and the audience you hope to reach, and then we can get into some of the specific examples.
Great, and that's a great question and place to begin, Brett. But let me begin by thanking you and Mike for doing this and for those nice words, and thanking everyone for joining. This would be a pleasure to talk about in any circumstances, but doing it with Mike and Brett, who were great colleagues in government and great friends, makes it even more of a pleasure. So I think you're right, Brett, to ask, why we keep doing this again, if the track record, as I argue in the book, is so manifestly poor of our interventions to change regimes in the Middle East. And it's doubly interesting, I think, especially for those of us, three of us from the Obama administration, a president who to a degree got elected because of his opposition, because of this notion that Americans were fed up with regime change and didn't want to do it anymore, right? That was one of the things that led me to write the book. My own experience with an administration that came about in part in opposition to military intervention in the Middle East to change regimes, notably the Iraq War. Let's not forget Barack Obama, to a degree, won the Democratic primary in 2008 because Hillary Clinton had supported the war and he had opposed it famously. And then he ran in the general election against John McCain, who had supported the war and the surge, and that was deeply unpopular by 2008. And I imagine, Brett, there were moderators in 2008 and 9 asking similar questions or burying the notion of regime change. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask is, looking back at our own experience, how did we go from that to even seeing Barack Obama pursuing versions of regime change in the Middle East? And by that, I mean in Egypt, Libya, and Syria. So one of the things I wanted to reflect on is, what is it about our system that leads presidents to go down that road, even presidents who are otherwise instinctively opposed and pretty disciplined? The other thing that led me to do this now, or over the past year or two, was in part in response to watching the Trump administration make its Iran policy. Because the official policy of the Trump administration, of course, hasn't been regime change. But in practice, as Trump walked away from the Iran nuclear deal, made demands on Iran, nuclear demands that seemed designed to be rejected, and put this maximum pressure campaign, it looked like Trump was himself gearing up to, not looked like, it really does seem to be the policy, to put enough pressure on Iran to the point that the public rises up and gets rid of the regime. And there's some in the administration now who formally advocate for that. So in that sense, regime change is not dead and buried. It's a policy debate that is going on now. So in that context, it seemed to me, before we go down that road again, might it not be useful to take a step back and look at our history to try to learn from it, of previous episodes where we set out to change regimes in the Middle East. And so that's what the book is, going back 70 years to the multiple times where the United States has pursued such policies.
So that's a good, so let me kind of start on that big, kind of broaden the lens, and then we can hone in on some of the specific examples. You talk about political culture, but it's really strategic culture, the strategic culture of multiple administrations, right? So, and right, President George W. Bush ran on, I think Condi Rice, our colleague here at Stanford, a very famous foreign affairs article that we need a more kind of humble foreign policy, that our military should not be the business of nation building. President Obama, of course, ran on the very agenda you just mentioned. And yet both of them found themselves in a different but somewhat similar situation in reaction to events around the world, and particularly in the Middle East. So you and I have been in the Situation Room a lot. I think just the fact of the Situation Room, I think, creates a sense, particularly to younger folks who maybe are new to it, that we're kind of more in command than we might think. But just this issue of strategic culture, of any president has to speak to the universality of American values and our exceptionalism. But that can be very dangerous if it translates into setting foreign policy objectives. And I think your book covers very well that also just the speed of information these days, that presidents can be kind of pushed into reacting to events as they unfold. So this question of American strategic culture, which I think transcends both parties, and I mean, how do you kind of grapple with that question of any president has to think big, but also has to be very disciplined in setting our objectives. And it's actually a very difficult formula in practice. So I just maybe address that up front, and then we can hone in on some of the cases.
Absolutely. It's a really important point. I think there are two things going on. There's strategic culture and there's US power. First, I think you're right to remind us that some might have thought regime change and intervention was buried even before the Bush administration. I made the point that it seemed buried after the Iraq War, but you're absolutely right. I mean, George W. Bush ran on humble foreign policy, nation building at home. Condi Rice also wrote that, you know, the 82nd Airborne is not designed to escort kids to kindergarten. Colin Powell, and even Dick Cheney. And of course, after the first Gulf War, Dick Cheney was a realist who didn't think we should go to Baghdad. So it seemed buried then, and yet a particular set of events, in this case, I think 9/11, turned that administration into one that was willing to have much more ambitious aims in the Middle East. And then the Arab Spring and other factors that I'll get to in a minute pulled Obama into the region. So Obama wasn't the first time that it looked like this was in our past. And the answer to that question, I think, is this combination of US power and strategic culture. I mentioned power, and this is a particular American thing, and you mentioned the Situation Room. This doesn't happen in other countries' Situation Rooms for the most part, because it's just not an option for most other countries to think, maybe the answer to this question is to invade Iraq and send 100,000 troops. And people aren't calling on them to do so. People call the United States, I'll describe shortly, I'm sure it'll come up, the pressures we felt to intervene in Libya from our European allies and some of our regional allies. And in Syria, the same thing. And again, in Iraq, only the United States even had the option of intervening or pursuing regime change. So partly it just stems from US power. And that US power is partly responsible for the strategic culture that you describe, or at least you hint at, and I talk about in the book. It's a very American phenomenon to believe that every problem has a solution, and that in such cases, the solution is American power, a can-do attitude. If we put our mind to it, we can accomplish great things. And that obviously derives from having done so in the past. We have accomplished great things. And that can be a very positive instinct, right? Optimism and willingness to tackle big problems. But it can also be dangerous if you overstate and overreach. Then you can find yourself in trouble. And in fact, all of the episodes I describe in the book are cases of overreach, where we bit off more than we can chew because we were so convinced of our power that we set our goals too high and ended up paying a very big price, not reaching those goals and enduring tremendous costs.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. I try to teach my students here, and a book that I've been working on for some time, a bit of a work in progress, but what is going to discipline this decision process? And some say, well, Congress needs to get in the game, but I think they're probably, I think that is unlikely to happen just given the situation politically in the country. But one example I often give, Phil, in reading a book, it kind of fit within. It's not a war and peace, but JFK's moonshot speech is usually cited as the example of a president setting an objective, and then we harness our power and achieve it. But what's interesting is that before he gave that speech and set the objective, he had a memo in front of him from Wernher von Braun, the world's most preeminent rocket scientist, who we kind of stole from Germany after World War II, who analyzed the situation, actually said, we can go to the moon by the end of the decade. Here's exactly how we do it. And I have found in some foreign policy debates that kind of grounding in analysis is often missing. And I think when you get into, you mentioned Libya, but when you get into some of these case studies, the kind of grounding in what exactly is likely to happen if we do X, Y, that is often, sometimes it just can't be there because things are moving so fast. Over in the case of Syria, as you mentioned, there actually is an analysis in which the president asked for one, and he was basically told, every historical example, if we go down this road, it probably won't work. So just in terms of how advisors to a president in that room, I think it's extraordinary if you read your book, these decisions are made with a small group of people without too much accountability, frankly. And then afterwards you discuss and consult with Congress. I mean, how do you discipline that process so that we can be a little more deliberate?
So both of those cases are really interesting in this context of matching means and ends, and what we described as the pressures on the US and the US president to act. Libya is interesting because, again, I described, and I think I said at the beginning of that chapter, Barack Obama did not get elected anticipating that he would be launching a NATO operation in North Africa. That I think we can be pretty clear on. And yet, how did he find himself doing that early in his presidency? I relate in the book, anecdotally, you know, I knew Obama pretty well. I advised the campaign. I was at this point, as Mike said, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. So I wasn't doing Libya, so to speak, but I was watching it carefully. Our European allies obviously had a big stake. And I was pretty convinced we weren't going to, you know, Bob Gates was the Secretary of Defense. He was, you know, he figured he kept saying he had his hands full enough in Afghanistan and Iraq. He didn't exactly want to take on another war. I knew Obama's instincts about military intervention in the region. And I told my staff and colleagues, I just, you know, didn't think that was going to happen. And then as I recount in the book, I went down to the State Department gym for an evening workout and CNN was on. And I saw interviews with senators imploring the United States to act and put up a no-fly zone. And I said to myself, we are going to go into Libya. That just tipped me off to the pressures. I sensed it in that moment. We're just going to hear call after call after call to do it. And it's the sort of pressure that is hard to resist. And, you know, there were obviously legitimate reasons as well. There was a risk that Gaddafi would go into Benghazi. And that just started me thinking, this is going to happen. And then, you know, of course it did. And I talk about the pressures on the United States to act. I'll just finish another, I think, relevant anecdote. So the Situation Room that you described, the instinct was still to try to avoid intervening in the Middle East. And Washington was divided. The administration was divided. And so I accompanied Secretary Clinton to a G7 foreign ministers meeting in Paris, where this was at the top of the agenda. We still didn't have a policy because the president hadn't made up his mind. But the secretary had to then listen to our European allies, one after the other, French, British, Italian. You know, what are you guys doing? We need US leadership. Gaddafi's going to go into Benghazi. The US must act. That's hard to resist. It's hard to be the United States, the one with the Air Force to deal with this, right? Because they couldn't do it without us. And so I think that significantly helped sway Secretary Clinton to be supportive. Bob Gates later describes it as a 51-49 call, and without Secretary Clinton on board, it would have been 49-51, and that helped tip Obama in that direction. So I think that's a really relevant, you know, example of how this works. Whatever your pre-planning might have been about what your interests were and what you would do, the pressures that you face from allies, Congress, people on the ground, are hard to resist. I won't, you know, go deep into Syria now, but you can describe the same thing there. Obama was famously disinclined to intervene, but ultimately the pressures from all those different places led to a different policy.
You also, just before I leave Libya, because you also mentioned, I think the way you present it is very important, because I think to assess these questions, and you know, we have the benefit of hindsight, but if you put yourself in the shoes of the president at the time, as you lay it, we have our European allies are ready to act. The Arab League has said it's ready to act. We ended up getting UN Security Council resolution after this made. But also these Libyans who are supposedly the government in waiting, who are ready to come in and fill the vacuum, present themselves, and they're obviously Libyan patriots and great well-meaning people, but they present themselves to the Secretary of State as, we're ready to take charge, and you know, and they're pretty well coached, I think, from outsiders, as you mentioned. This is also an issue of, well, who's going to fill the vacuum? There always seems to be an easy answer to that, and it ends up being much more difficult in practice. So maybe through the prism of Libya, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can do that through the prism of Libya, but it's actually through the prism of the entire book. All of these cases have a similar story. And that's one of the things that struck me. And I haven't really said yet, but when I say going back to the beginning, I do the Iran coup in 1953, the support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s against the Soviet-backed government. There's then the overthrow of the Taliban, again, a second regime change in Afghanistan, Iraq War 2003, and then the cases we've been discussing in Egypt, Libya, and Syria. And one of the things that's was striking to me and appears throughout the book is just these repeated patterns. And that is indeed one of them. once the United States decides that its policy is regime change, everything changes, including the analysis. Like pre that moment, we can contain the problem, we can deter the regime, we can live with it. But then as soon as it tips into we must change the regime, the analysis starts to change, the optimism comes in, and the notion of filling the vacuum gets overstated. We start seeing what we want to see and believing what we want to see. So, we put the Shah in power in Iran, and we just hope that he'll be conciliatory and bring the people together. In Afghanistan, frankly, we didn't really think about what came next. We just supported the opposition. We can come back to that. In Iraq, clearly, we just wanted to believe that if we got rid of Saddam, who, by the way, in all of these cases, you could understand the reasons for wanting to get rid of these terrible regimes. But we persuaded ourselves, or the Bush administration persuaded itself, that if we got rid of him, the vacuum would be filled by decent people who would find a way to work together. And not only did they persuade themselves of that, but they persuaded others. That was part of the spiel in selling, or you could even say overselling, the war. And one of the phenomena we see over and over again is these oppositions unite in agreeing to get rid of that regime. But as soon as the regime falls, then their interests are deeply different, and you do have a vacuum. And we clearly had that in Iraq, and we couldn't fix the problem. We clearly had it in Libya as well. Same in Egypt. The opposition to Mubarak was strange bedfellows, but as soon as he was gone, they were no longer together. And we won't even get into the hundreds or more than 1,000 different groups in Syria that didn't manage to overthrow the regime, but if they had, would have also been fighting over the spoil. So it's a phenomenon that goes over and over again. And part of why I wanted to write this book is that, having watched this movie 7 times now, I just think it's important to say the next time policy analysts or a president comes along and says, I've met with the opposition, they're united, they're going to be stable democratic partners, be very skeptical, because we've said that before and it hasn't been true.
So Phil, let's maybe dive into Syria a little bit, which we both obviously have dealt with. I got into Syria in the summer, fall 2014 timeframe out of the campaign against ISIS. You saw it even earlier as the policy developed. And a couple things I think important about your book. You cut against conventional wisdom, I think, in a few points. The Afghanistan intervention in the 80s, support for the Mujahideen, which I think is generally seen as a low-cost, very high-impact, successful intervention. It led to one of the many dominoes that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Obviously, the unintended consequences decades later led to something very different. The 1953 coup in Tehran, which led, some could say, to 26 years of somewhat stability. But Syria in particular, I think Syria is generally seen, and another Stanford colleague of ours, H.R. McMaster, has recently written a book saying it was really a lesson in the cost of inaction, that there were options that were not pursued, and that so Syria and the catastrophe that unfolded was far more a sin of omission than commission. And your chapter on Syria kind of cuts against that grain. And you were there in these debates in the 2013 timeframe. So just kind of how do you analyze the Syria case? And some would say it really wasn't a case of regime change because we were never particularly serious about it. We set the objective but didn't do too much to follow through. I think you demonstrated very convincingly that that's actually not quite accurate. But as someone who was there in the room and has now studied it, kind of over to you in that most difficult case, which is now still ongoing.
So let me say 2 things. One, just briefly on Afghanistan, because you mentioned it, and then Syria, because I do think Afghanistan, the Mujahideen support, and it's relevant, it's highly relevant for Syria, and it actually came up as we debated whether to arm the opposition in a similar way. But what I wanted to say about the case of the Mujahideen, you're absolutely right that the conventional wisdom on that is that was a case that really worked, right? In the 1980s, you get the Soviet invasion, Jimmy Carter responds, and then even more Ronald Reagan. We end up working with the Saudis to arm the opposition, and that puts pressure on the Soviets, and not only do they leave Afghanistan in 1989, the Soviet Union collapses. And so for a very limited, relatively speaking, amount of money, we achieve regime change and a huge geopolitical success. So that has sort of gone down in lore as, you know, how this can work. And it came up repeatedly in successive cases where advocates of regime change say, we can do this. Look, you know, look at the Mujahideen, look at that case. So it was interesting for me to look at it and realize, you know, all of that is superficially true. We didn't lose American service people, and we didn't spend a lot of money, and the Soviet Union did fall. However, when you look at it in its full picture and the costs and unintended consequences, it's less clearly an example of how this can be such a wonderful thing, which is to say, yes, you know, we did support an opposition that ultimately overthrew the government and weakened the Soviet Union, but it also led to a 10-year-long civil war. It took 10 years to get this done, during which time more than 1 million Afghans were killed and 5 million fled and ended up in camps in Pakistan. It then took 3 more years before the government actually fell, even though the Soviet Union wasn't backing it anymore. And then you had 4 more years of chaos that only ended when the Taliban took over and imposed this dystopia in Afghanistan and harbored al-Qaeda, which was partly inspired by the victory of the Mujahideen in taking down a superpower, which then attacked us on 9/11, which then led us to have to intervene again in Afghanistan, where we still are 20 years later, having spent $1 trillion and lost more than 1,000 Americans and many others. So when you put it in the broad scope of things, it's less clear to me that that was just an obvious case of how you can get these things done. There's a fascinating historical discussion and a famous quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was, of course, Carter's national security advisor, dismissing this notion in a 1998 interview, where he says, come on, what's more important, the end of the Cold War or some stirred up Muslims, is how he put it, again, dismissively. Maybe pre 9/11 and pre what we've seen since, you could make that argument. But now I think, that latter problem looms much larger. And by the way, last point, and I think, McFall's probably still on this call, he might jump in on this. I think that also overstates the degree to which that ended the Cold War in the Soviet Union. And we just remind people that Gorbachev actually came to power before we had delivered Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen. So, let's also not do that quick thing where we armed the opposition and that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. So that was, I think that's important to understand on Afghanistan, which does illuminate Syria. And let me just briefly answer your question on that, because you're right. My view cuts against the grain of conventional wisdom on Syria, because the conventional wisdom is Obama set out this goal and he rightly said Assad must go, but he didn't do enough. And had he done more, then Assad would have gone and we could have had this positive transition in Syria. First, let me acknowledge, Syria was a tragedy, first and foremost, for the Syrians, and anyone involved in that policy can only look back at it with regret. It was a devastating tragedy for the country and for its neighbors and others. But I am not persuaded, as you say, I argue in the book, that doing a little bit more, or frankly, even a lot more, would have solved this problem, which is the critique that you alluded to. Indeed, one of my arguments throughout the book is the persistent fantasy that limited amounts of military force can achieve far-reaching goals like getting rid of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Everything we've seen in all these other cases suggests that it takes much more than that. And so I'm not persuaded that I talk about in the book this if only notion. People look back at each case, say, if only we had done this, if only we had done that. In the Syrian case, if only is usually, if only Obama had agreed with General Petraeus and Secretary Clinton in August 2012 to arm the opposition, this would have worked. If only Obama had gone through with bombing in August 2013, we could have gotten rid of Assad. If only Obama had done airstrikes in Aleppo, before the Russians came in, this would have gone much better. If only Obama had provided more advanced military equipment to the opposition, I think that there's not evidence for that. In fact, we didn't do nothing in Syria. That's one of the big myths of this whole critique. It implies that we didn't do anything to support the opposition. I think it's quite well known that there was a lot of support, including military support, given to the opposition. It led not to the end of the war or the overthrow of Assad, but counter-escalation by Russia and Iran. There's much more to say about this, but I think that it is really important to think this one through. It is clear that what we did not work, but I argue that what we did escalated and perpetuated the conflict without any realistic prospect of bringing about its end. And in many ways, that's the worst of all worlds.
So I would encourage, we have over 100, well over 100 participants, which is great. I'd encourage everyone to submit questions because we'll go to a Q&A fairly soon. I already have a few in the queue, but please submit your questions. A final question for you, Phil, which we could talk about Syria all day. I mean, my experience in 2009, I was in the Middle East and I was in Iraq in particular, and our policy was to open up to Assad. George Mitchell was in Damascus. There's kind of a parade of senior officials to Damascus. We wanted the Iraqis to recognize Assad, do some things which they didn't want to do. And then you fast forward to 2011, we were in the process of withdrawing our forces. Pretty clear we're going to withdraw our forces from Iraq. Whether or not you thought of that decision, we're pulling out significant means as we set this new objective of Assad must go next door. And like for any of us who had been working on Iraq for the last decade or so, in that extremely difficult experience, it was kind of like, wait a minute, what are we getting ourselves into? And frankly, I did hear that from almost everybody in Iraq at the time, whether senior, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, whoever it might be, a real concern about everything you then tell in the book about the vacuum. But let me just, an anecdote from the summer, fall of 2014. So one of the unintended consequences, which there's a number of reasons for it, but obviously the rise of ISIS. And when ISIS kind of sweeps into Iraq in particular in the summer of 2014, you were in the Situation Room with President Obama. I was in Erbil and then Baghdad trying to deal with the situation on the ground. And we were grappling with exactly what to do. And I think those of us out there at the time were calling for a fairly immediate, some form of military intervention, just given the dire situation. President Obama pushed us very hard to get certain, which I think was right in retrospect, and I very much agree with him, that we had to get an Iraqi government in place, we had to have a coalition, we had to have Congress, we had to have these pieces in place before we acted. But I have some participant bias here, but I see the Iraq, or the counter-ISIS campaign as an example of trying to learn these very hard lessons, recognizing we're not going to be able to do everything. What might be desirable is very much divorced from what is possible, and being very clear on our objectives and pursuing a campaign with a set of approximate objectives as we go, which I think led us to actually a pretty good situation which Trump then threw away. And I don't want to go off on down a rabbit hole, but you were very much a part of developing this counter-ISIS campaign. And I think the thesis of your book is not, and it would be important for those who haven't read it yet, I think, do not take away the thesis of what Phil is recommending. We should not just withdraw from the Middle East or disengage from the Middle East, as some say. But actually we do have enduring interests, and it's about how we pursue them, how we set objectives, how we resource them. So I'm just curious how you see the counter-ISIS campaign, which led to a new military intervention. We're still there, in the background context of these broader lessons you're drawing, and then I'll get to the.
No, it's great you raised that, Brett. Thanks. It allows me to say a couple of things. The first is to pay tribute to the work you did. You're reminding me and others, but for the people who don't know, Brett was out in the field through all of this and doing heroic work, often in Baghdad, but elsewhere in the region. In fact, Brett, I have a bit of PTSD seeing you on the screen because it reminds me of all of these sit room meetings, which were probably more painful for you because it was 3 a.m. in Baghdad and you were weighing in from the field, but these were serious issues and serious times. And it allows me to make the point, and thank you for raising it, that I am not indeed arguing, like some, that because we have failed to achieve these maximalist objectives in a number of cases, then forget it, it's too hard and we should walk away from the region. That is a risk. I mean, I think you hear that on the right and the left. It's certainly President Trump's view, with this odd exception of Iran, where he somehow wants to change the regime, but also not be bogged down in the region. But he's constantly saying it's not worth it, we waste our money. But you're also here on the left in this endless wars debate. And I do think the counter-ISIS campaign does show some degree of middle ground. I said earlier that the problem is often when you have maximalist objectives and limited means. I think the counter-ISIS campaign came much closer to pairing means and objectives. We did have an interest in preventing ISIS from consolidating its territorial caliphate and building itself up as a global terrorist group. So I think we came up with a realistic strategy that was not deploying 150,000 troops with the goal of implanting democracy or setting up some new government in the region, but we used our assets. We worked with partners in order to prevent ISIS from perpetuating its rule and reign of terror. So that is an interesting counterexample. You could almost argue that this was a case of regime change that succeeded. If you want to concede that the Islamic State was actually a state, in that sense, we actually did, but we didn't do it with the pretense that we were going to go in and put in massive forces and stay forever. So I do think I welcome the chance to say, or at least make this distinction. If you're not in the endless wars debate, if you're not distinguishing between 150,000 combat troops in Iraq and a few hundred special operators in Syria on a counterterrorism mission, then you're really not doing sound analysis, in my view.
Yeah, I very much agree. And a question from Tom Fingar, who's a colleague here at Stanford, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, which kind of gets to this point. And I'll just read it because I'm very curious how this kind of fits into the soup of the day of great power competition. Is there a policy option between active regime change and support for unrepresentative and repressive regimes? And might that option be to disengage? Because we and our European allies do not need the oil and gas from the region as we used to. And would Russia or China step into that vacuum and produce a worse or better situation than the otherwise natural evolution of the region?
Yeah, there is a lot of talk of disengagement based on energy independence, which I think overstates energy independence. It is true that the United States doesn't depend directly on Middle Eastern oil and energy as much as it did in the past, especially with fracking and so on. But it's also true that so long as the world does, in which it does, and the Strait of Hormuz is still responsible for 2/3 of global oil shipments, we have an interest in maintaining that. And if our allies in India, South Korea, and important economies like China and Europe depend on oil from the region, then we have a stake in it too. So I'm not persuaded that energy independence is the magic key that is going to allow us to disengage from the region. I think for me, the medium ground is disengagement is the wrong word, but understanding that maximalist objectives like going into Iraq and Afghanistan and staying for 20 years and trying to set up stable democracies is well beyond our means and not enough of a US interest to merit the resource costs that we have put behind it. But as I said before, I'm not to the point where I think we can now say, we've got our own oil, this region doesn't matter to us and we should focus on other things. Again, you can distinguish between massive time and financial and human resources thrown at the region and getting out entirely. My last point, I think the question about great power competition was not meant prioritizing great competition outside of the region, but I'll just say where the region itself is concerned, some made the case that we needed to do more in Syria to keep the Russians out. And I think that's a unpersuasive reason why for the United States to get more deeply involved in Syria, right? So the Russians were already there. And yes, we could have, if we prioritized keeping the Russians out, gone in ourselves, but that to me would have been a costly mistake.
Another question from Michael Cruz. It gets to the point of, I think it's a good question. How can we respond to domestic opposition movements without making it look like we are supporting regime change? And the classic example being the 2009 Green Movement in Iran. Mm-hmm. Kind of, as a policymaker trying to get this right, what is the formula and how do you kind of think through that those middle cases.
Right. So, I mean, I think as a general rule, we should always, as the United States, stand for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of protest. We should always oppose with the means we can governmental repression and stand up for human rights and press these governments on those issues. So I'm not, so totally in this realist camp of, forget it, nothing we can do, it's not our issue. I think we should stand for such things. I think we need to be very careful, however, in lining ourselves up with groups who don't have the means to change their governments and yet might resort to violence to do so. I mean, we can talk more about this in the case of Syria. It's not a question of whether it's in our interest to see a different regime. In almost all of these cases, it was and is. The question is whether it is within our capacity to support these groups in a way that will effectively do so, that will A, bring about the change of regime, and B, lead to something stable in its aftermath. I think 2009 Iran is a great and widely misunderstood example because it always comes up as a mistake that, I talk about if only Obama had not shied away from standing with these protesters, well, that people usually don't finish the sentence. What exactly would have happened? Right, this is in the lore, and frankly, even among many supporters of President Obama in other ways. Secretary Hillary Clinton wrote in her memoirs that this was a mistake not to have done more and spoken out more clearly in 2009. That's an easy thing to say and think, right? And people know the context. The Iranians have a fraudulent election. People start protesting it, and President Obama was very careful about aligning himself with them. He actually did criticize the election interference and stood up for freedom of speech and protest, but quietly and not immediately and harshly, because he was worried about tarring with the supporters with US support. But the more important point is this: what do people imply would have happened if we had been more forceful? If the president had immediately gone to the podium, denounced the fraudulent election, said the United States is with the protesters, I'm not sure what is implied, that the regime would have shied away from using force against them as it did, or the protesters would have been emboldened to go further. There are shades of President George H.W. Bush in the Iraqi Shia in 1991, when we did such a thing and called on Saddam to step aside and that the Iraqi Shia should rise up. But then when Saddam massacred them, we weren't prepared to do anything about it. So I think we have to be very careful about that. And I talk about the risk of moral hazard and unintended consequences in the book. And there was some interplay between Libya and Syria here, right? If the United States shows itself willing to listen to these protesters and join them, especially if they are going to try to use violence to get rid of the regime, you are implying that you're going to do that the next time groups rise up and potentially use violence to get rid of the regime. And if you're not going to finish that job, it is probably smarter to avoid starting it and calling for it in the first place.
I think it is and there's a moral hazard, which you talk about in the book, but also I think I experienced this up close, as I think you did as a diplomat, just meeting Syrians in the 2015 timeframe who did believe, I don't know if they were ever told or they just believed that the cavalry was coming.
Yeah.
US military would be coming. And this was a lot of Syrians believed this, I think, and made decisions in their individual lives and elsewhere and other things, which is part of the tragedy of it. So it is a very difficult line to draw.
It is tragic, and it is, it is understandable why we want to help such people. They're very sympathetic figures. I think we went through that experience in Egypt, in Libya and Syria. I met with many of them myself. Syrian opposition figures who opposed the repression of the regime, whose families may have been imprisoned or tortured, who wanted freedom, and you want to help them. And that's partly what leads us to do this. So it's understandable, but it is also risky to imagine that there is some path to getting rid of this dictatorship and repression that doesn't lead to security vacuum, instability, and make things worse. And we do fall prey to that. I mean, I discussed that in Iraq. The Bush administration persuaded itself that these sympathetic opposition figures would and could install democracy that we could work with in Iraq, and that obviously clearly wasn't the case. Same was true in Libya. We want to believe this. They say the right things. They know how to say the right things, but don't have the means to bring about this positive transition. And again, if you're not going to succeed in bringing that about, I think that's the lesson of Syria. It's better not to go down that road in the first place.
Bill, we have a question about, it gets to where we are now as a country in terms of transitions and thinking through just how fast does the new administration come out of the gates on issues pertaining to the Middle East. I think particularly difficult now, given that the overreaching priority obviously is our domestic situation and COVID, the economy. So this gets into, I think, what the overall approach should be. But the question is about the Obama administration, and was it a mistake kind of in the early first year or so, the Cairo speech combined with sending some signals that we were repositioning Asia. Was there a mistake in kind of not taking a slower, more deliberate approach before kind of coming out and affirming some larger principles? I think it's actually just, I'm thinking through the question reading, I think it's a difficult question to answer. But
right.
This is a question about how a new administration,
right.
I think we're fortunate that the president-elect has more experience than any incoming president in my lifetime, but for a long time. And it'll take time to really get up to speed, particularly what Trump's doing in the transition, with what is really the atmosphere in these capitals. So just how should the incoming administration approach this? And is it a critique of the Obama administration early on that they came out a little too ambitious on kind of a new approach to the Middle East?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this reminds me of the famous, Harold Macmillan line about foreign policy, events, dear boy, events. Obama didn't come out of the gate with the view of transforming the Middle East. Yes, he gave a positive Cairo speech, but if you look at it, it's more about Palestinians in Iran than about, democracy in North Africa and the rest of the region. Even though one of the elements towards the end was about participation, women's rights, and so on. But that implies somehow that Obama came in and was going to make this a big part of his agenda. No, it happened to us. This was not, when you enter government, you have all your plans and the things you want to get done, and you have your list of things. And like I said, the irony of that is actually the opposite. George W. Bush had an agenda of democratizing the Middle East, a freedom agenda. He made it his top priority. He acted on it in Iraq. But frankly, by the second term, when Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State, this was not the top priority of the Bush administration. It had gone badly in Iraq. It certainly didn't spill over to the rest of the region. And like I said, Obama gets elected more on a realist platform, more similar to the first President Bush. So that's the irony of Obama pursuing these goals. Is it was almost like just when the United States decided as a matter of policy that we were not going to have a freedom agenda, that we ended up inheriting one. So I don't think in that sense it was a mistake for Obama. It happened on his watch. And in the case of Egypt, there are a lot of sympathetic Egyptian protesters. He decided in that case, we haven't really gone into Egypt, but he decided in that case that this was going to happen anyway, right? Mubarak was being pushed out by the Egyptian people. We might as well get on the right side of that. I'm going to be clear about that. So that happened to us, and we took advantage of it, and I think probably overstated what we could accomplish, but it happened to us. Libya, we didn't foment the uprising. Once it started in Tunisia, another irony in all of this, of course, is where did this start? It started in the one country that we had very little to do with, right? When a fruit vendor burned himself on fire after being humiliated by the police, and then the Tunisian dictator fled, and this was all self-perpetuating. So it wasn't policy. If the Obama administration is guilty of anything, if that's the right word, it may be allowing these developments to persuade Obama that we could accomplish things that he came in, not thinking were going to be priorities that he would try to accomplish. But it wasn't a case of actively putting that on the agenda. Again, this is important to say as a new administration is about to start. Whatever your plans are, stuff happens to you and you react to them. I will say one word about, what the incoming administration will face, and actually goes back to the very first question you asked, Brett, about why do we keep doing this again? And, is it ever going to stop? We may be entering a new phase. I mean, we talked about American strategic culture that leads us to have these aims and be willing to try such things. But, you know, with the new administration going to be facing the COVID challenge, the tremendous climate change challenge, China challenge, it will just have spent, you know, $4 trillion dealing with COVID. Americans generally are fed up with such costs of intervention. I think, you know, the appetite for taking on such things is going to be very limited, to say the least.
Yeah, I think in the internal disciplining function, again, what I try to tell my students, if you're ever in the Situation Room and there's a policy debate and you're being assigned a task, really at whatever level, you know, ask 3 questions. It gets to ends, ways, and means, the timeless law of ends, ways, and means. But what is my objective? How am I going to do it? And what are my resources? And if there's fuzziness there, or if there's a major gap, history tells us you're going to run into problems. And I have found across 3 administrations, you talk about it in the book, the use of kind of metaphors. We have to just send a brushback pitch, or we have to get his attention. We need skin in the game. We need, like, it can be very dangerous. So making sure there is rigor in your thinking. I think just given where we are as a country, that is going to happen by necessity. Also, just knowing Joe Biden is going to happen by the nature of who he is as a president. But culturally, I think it'd be good to really embed that going forward.
I think that's one of the most important lessons of the book, or messages of the book, I hope people take away. And, you know, thank you for bringing up the metaphors. That is fuzzy thinking, to coin a previous debate phrase. You know, what does that mean? I really got frustrated with this debate of people advocating certain military actions in Syria to get Assad to the table. That wasn't the issue. I mean, let's be clear. And I think you brought up, you know, did we really have a regime change policy in Syria? Yes, we did. I mean, the issue wasn't getting Assad to the table. There wasn't going to be a power sharing arrangement between Assad and the opposition. We were going to either use whatever force it took to overthrow him, or accept that he was going to be there. But we would comfort ourselves in notion that the goal was a political transition. Again, for Assad's ears, for the listener there, it was the end of his regime, his family, his role, and, you know, possibly his life, this political transition that we were trying to bring about. And so it wasn't, I think you have to be brutally honest with yourself what you're trying to accomplish. Bringing him to the table was not really the goal, or sending him a message. People would all advocate we would send him a message. I disagreed with, even after I left the administration, you were still in it, you remember the dissent cable from a number of our state colleagues that argued against the Obama policy and called for a judicious use of force, if I remember the language in it, judicious use of force to compel the Assad regime to negotiate in good faith. I think you have to be careful. The Assad regime was not going to negotiate in good faith. I think the choices in Syria were to use enough force to overthrow the regime, or to accept that we were just escalating and perpetuating a civil war that wouldn't end. It's really hard to do, going back to our previous discussion of the pressures. You have to testify to Congress. The press is all over it. There are people dying. So you want to comfort yourself by doing something, but the risk there is falling between 2 stools. And that's, you know, I think that's the greater critique of policy in Syria. It was clear that what we were doing was not working. And so the choice really was escalate to the point and do whatever it took to decisively win with all the costs and consequences, or de-escalate, but not perpetuate that.
I'm going to ask you a question that just came to mind, but it's something I've been thinking about. I'll start just with an anecdote. And in the Trump administration in Syria, we found ourselves one night, about 300 combatants were approaching one of our outposts, and it was unclear who they were. We sent warnings through our kind of channel with the Russians and others to say, hey, whoever's there, and then we started being fired upon. And so Secretary of Defense Mattis gave the order to act in self-defense, and our military forces, which has been recorded, so annihilated about 300 of these attacking forces, which ended up being Russian contractors. And as someone who led a channel with the Russians on Syria, I won't go into too much of it, but I actually brought this up with them, and they like acted as if they had never heard of such a thing happen. Total denial, total deniability. And we're getting into a era of this kind of warfare, of just deniable proxy groups, state-sponsored. The Russians do this, Iran obviously does this, Turkey does it, I think. And it's a question I think future administrations will face. Do we start to get into this game? And I think it's a very dangerous game, having seen it up close. But having studied all these cases, to the extent you can talk about it, there's overt military operations, there's covert mechanisms, such as Afghanistan in the 80s. Just as we enter this new era of deniable warfare, which we're seeing, just how do you think through that, given that you've studied all these cases here over the last 50 years? It's not directly related to your book, but I think it is very much something that is upon us. And I think that the default might be, well, we should play that game too. We could do these things behind the scenes invisibly. I think that can lead you into some traps, but over to you.
Well, I mean, that is a risk. Do we have the stomach and the staying power and the political support for doing so, of getting involved in the ground? It gets very messy. The locals often care more than we do and have a lot more at stake. It's another one of the things that I show in the book that we overlook each time, is the role of regional spoilers. We just sort of think of it in our terms, forgetting that the enemy has a vote, and they're there, they live there, they're prepared to outlast you. They care more about it than you do. And so, you know, in terms of, do we want to start playing that game too, there is a real risk that we just don't have the stomach for it. And, you know, that was a constraint for all the criticism of, you know, Obama not doing enough. So, you know, if the lesson of Iraq was we tried to do too much and we got bogged down, did a big occupation, people said Obama didn't do enough in Libya. Well, one is, I would question the premise, and, you know, begs this question of, didn't we just learn in Iraq that even putting in large numbers of US forces doesn't necessarily keep the peace, and the neighbors and others would undermine you? But one reason for that was there was just no public support for it. Obama couldn't get authorization to put major forces in Libya, even if he wanted to. Are you kidding? That's one reason we ended up doing the light footprint. I remember debates where we were trying to get congressional approval to have one civilian in Tripoli in this context, and we had to pull our embassy and ambassador out. So I just don't think there's a public appetite for playing that game, beyond the fact that, you know, it's a dangerous game. And that's where we ended up in Syria, where, you know, we weren't going to go in on the ground. There was certainly no appetite for deploying US forces to Syria. So we did end up working with and supporting opposition groups. But, you know, what comes out of the other end of that? And I would always say, in the case of Syria, that I didn't know if somehow this did manage to displace the Assad regime by the end, after years of violence, like the Mujahideen. I didn't know who would eventually come out on top, but it wasn't going to be those sympathetic Syrian opposition figures that we met with it in our offices in Washington. It would be, if Afghanistan was any precedent, the more extreme groups and the more violent ones. So that's, to me, a dangerous way of thinking about it, that, you know, we can start playing that game too. And I don't see how that serves US interests.
So Phil, we're about out of time. I think that the theme of the question is just, I'll leave you with this, and if you want to touch on it, you kind of already did, but there's a theme playing across everything about the line between just standard democracy promotion, which we do as the United States of America, versus regime change, and where to draw that line. Mm-hmm. And also, what makes an opposition more effective than others? Has this been studied? Is it something that should be studied? You've talked about a lot of opposition groups that have ended up not actually being so much effective when a vacuum opens up. Are there examples that you can think of actually that was fairly well done? Is there kind of a counter example?
Yeah, I can just make a broad point about that, and obviously this could be an entire other hour discussion. A lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about this. We don't know exactly what leads to democracy around the world, but we have a pretty good sense that you have a better chance at it when there is some past history with institutions or even democracy, a certain degree of economic development, and a certain degree of homogeneity, if not ethnic and cultural, at least a sense of nationhood. And the problem, especially in the Middle East, is none of those things exist. So even if you do have a chance of spreading democracy, or we've done it historically in other places in Europe, to a lesser degree in Latin America, in the Middle East, with artificial countries and artificial borders and deep ethnic, cultural, religious divisions, the prospect of spreading democracy is poor, but it's particularly poor on the heels of violent regime change. And that's really my message, because people can fairly ask, so what's the alternative to it? If you want to make the case that the track record is historically terrible and we've never really pulled it off. The alternative, broadly speaking, is some combination of deterrence and containment and development and engagement and arms control, buying time to give internal groups an opportunity to generate peaceful change as opposed to violent change. It has never worked when we've tried to do it either with direct US military force or US support for violent opposition. In other places around the world, the track record of engagement, even in dictatorships, you take Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, there is a much greater chance at democratization taking place when there is engagement, trade, development, and an opportunity for a middle class to develop and internal pressure. So that is a broad set of lessons I think is relevant for how we approach these things.
Good. And there's a final question, which I'll just say, buy Phil's book, and he does cover this. Some differences with our own hemisphere and whether they apply, because you do address that. Maybe I'll say, buy the book.
Exactly. We have to leave something for some mystery out there for people to.
Some key differences, both in ends and means, and also just fundamental differences in the situation. Phil, I think this book is extremely timely. As I said in the beginning, it is a very important and easy read. I think it's just the way the chapters are done is quite well done. Anyone who's written a book, trying to write a book in COVID with a 3-year-old is extremely difficult. And hats off to you getting this done and out there in such a timely way. Any final words, and then we'll close out.
No, I appreciated the opportunity to engage on what I think we all find are really important issues. So thanks for hosting me. I'm looking forward to your book, even if it's coming along more slowly. I appreciate that you're listening to mine as you go jogging, but thanks to everybody for joining. I really appreciated it. It's an interesting discussion.
Okay, thank you, everybody.